Good evening, everyone. I invite you to please take your seats so that we can get started. Thank you. Welcome to the Cleveland Heights University Heights School Funding and EdChoice presentation. I am the new superintendent, Liz Kirby, and I want to thank you for coming out to be with us this chilly January evening. Our goal tonight is that you leave here learning new and valuable facts about how our district is funded and where your tax dollars go, along with the realities of what our district is facing as it relates to EdChoice. I want to thank the student volunteers from the Heights High National Honor Society, the Link crew, and the AFS Foreign Exchange students for welcoming our guests. I also want to thank the Cleveland Heights University Heights staff and families who are with us tonight, the PTA Council and building representatives, Reaching Heights, Future Heights, and all of our Heights community members who are joining us. We know that your time is valuable, and we really appreciate you taking that time out to get this important information. Tonight, we have several elected officials that I do want to recognize. Our first is Merle Johnson, who is our representative from the State Board of Education. Merle, if you would stand, please. Also with us, we have Mary Dunbar from the Cleveland Heights City Council, and Jason Stein, the new mayor of Cleveland Heights. And I know we also have some other elected officials who will be joining us this evening after other commitments. We really appreciate you being with us, and of course, our board members, our president, Jody Serini, Vice President Jim Posh, our Treasurer Pro Tem Beverly Wright, Dan Hines, and Malia Lewis. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that although we will be discussing two of the most personal and emotional things in the world here, our money and our children, we want to make sure that we maintain proper decorum. We know these are very charged issues, not only in our community, but also in the state. So we ask you to be respectful of your neighbor during the presentation. Although there will not be a question and answer session, the board members, chief financial officer, and I will remain on hand after the presentation to talk further with you and answer any questions to the best of our ability. Now, I want to start off playing a quick game for this presentation. So one thing that I've been doing as a new superintendent is learning a lot about the district. So if you'd asked me these questions, of course, in August, I would have gotten all of them wrong. I've since learned other things. So I ask you to go to Kahoot.it on your phones. If you don't have your phones, we can also play old school style. So once you get there, please put in the game PIN. As you put the PIN in, we'll see who is linked in. All right, do we have any players yet? We're still waiting. Okay, so Phil, you're gonna have to answer all the questions. All right. All right, no hiding here. You see the names popping up. Okay, so as others join and get in, I'm gonna start with the questions. We have 5 multiple choice questions, and for each you will have 20 seconds to enter your answer for each one. This, by the way, is a tool that many of our teachers use in their classrooms to engage their students, and that we also use in our professional development with teachers to engage them as well. All right, so we have a pretty solid number. Okay, the first question. What is the average annual cost per student in Cleveland Heights, University Heights schools? All right. And our answer is $14,000 $14,404. Excellent. All right, good job. Next. What percentage of our district budget goes to classroom instruction? All right. And our answer is 67.1%. You guys are doing very well. All right, next question. What percentage of current EdChoice students within the district's boundaries have never attended a Cleveland Heights University Heights school? So these are the students who are using the voucher for their education, but they have not attended any of our schools. And the answer is, you are correct, 90 to 100%. The actual percentage is 94%, and we'll be talking about that. Next question. How many Ohio school districts, including the Cleveland Heights University Heights District, were named as an AP District Honor Roll recipient in 2019? Now, if you watch the board meetings, you know these answers. All right, once again, most of the audience is correct. It is 9. We are 1 of 9 with this honor in Ohio. And the last question, what percentage of Heights High students are currently participating in an art or music course? So this is here in the high school. All right, and the answer is, excellent. That was the highest responses. That was the most correct in the room, 42%, exactly. So this is just a warm up to some of the information that I'll be sharing later on in the presentation. We will be going into more detail, but we wanted to get you engaged and really see what the baseline knowledge is of the room around some of the critical facts for our district. So I'm now going to turn it over to our board president, Jody Serini.
Good evening, and Happy New Year. Welcome to the new decade. Thank you for coming tonight. And I don't know about everyone else, but usually I really enjoy seeing these, beginning of a new decade, end of a new decade stories that you see in the news this time of year. However, this year they were pretty grim, especially locally. How many of you saw this story, the most impactful stories of 2010? It was in the Cleveland Plain Dealer on New Year's Day. Anybody see this? Well, in case you missed it, here it is. And according to the Plain Dealer, the most impactful story of the 2010s for Cleveland was local government funding cuts. And this trend appears to be continuing in the most recent state biennial budget. And you probably wonder why I'm telling you this. I'm telling you this because it speaks to our choices and what kind of community we want to live in. Every time the state has stepped back from supporting communities, our community has stepped forward and made up the difference. It's who we are. And a lot of other communities haven't. And are those places that we want to live? I don't think so. We refuse to let that happen to us. We appreciate you and all your support. We wish we weren't the ones to have to ask for more. The purpose of tonight is to explain the position our state officials have put us in and what we are doing to fight back, and what we've been doing to minimize that ask. That's right, fiscal responsibility isn't something we expect only of the community. The Board of Education has made tough decisions and significant cuts, and tonight we'll cover the sacrifices that we've asked of our children. The issue of school funding often brings strong emotions. Before I begin, I want to stress that one of the greatest attributes of our community is that we are diverse and inclusive, and that is something we must protect and preserve. The topic of vouchers, also called scholarships by the Ohio Department of Education, can be highly charged. Across the state, we are seeing this topic pitting communities against each other. We cannot let that happen here. We cannot let this issue divide us. We need to unite our diverse interests to solve this situation which is affecting us. And that's why we're asking everyone in our community to unite around the idea of funding vouchers from a separate state budget. We'll give more details about specific actions that you can take later in this presentation, but first, let me explain how vouchers are contributing to our need to ask our community for a levy and why the way vouchers are currently funded is not sustainable. As I walk through this, I implore you to direct your emotions not at a friend or neighbor who is using a voucher. Instead, direct it at our state lawmakers. They are responsible for creating this problem, and they have the power to fix it. So first, a little history on school funding, and I'll try to cover this fast because I know it is in the handout. But once Ohio was granted statehood in 1803, it wasn't until 1825 that Ohio's government created a common system of schools for public education. This was financed with a half-mill property tax. Between 1825 and 1975, there was a series of ever-changing sales taxes on goods, but the one thing that is, consistent is that those no longer go toward education. In 1975, the Ohio Lottery was created, and there was much fanfare that the profits of this were going to go to education. However, all of the money that came in from the lottery was offset by money that was then transferred to the state general fund. So it was really a wash for the schools. In 1976, House Bill 920 passed. House Bill 920 froze property taxes at the amount of their original assessment. This means that the revenue school districts take in from local properties do not rise with inflation. This law is a major reason why school districts have to put levies on the ballot periodically. Since 1997, the Ohio Supreme Court has ruled multiple times that our state's form of school funding is unconstitutional, but lawmakers have done nothing to fix this problem. In 2005, EdChoice was created. This provided scholarships or vouchers to enable students from designated schools to attend private and non-public or religious schools. Between 2005 and now, a couple of additional scholarship vouchers have been created, and most recently in July, EdChoice was expanded again, and the state froze education funding for the next 2 years. The original intention behind EdChoice was to enable students to leave schools that are considered failing, and that would be failing according to the state report card. And I know there's a belief that if we just improved our performance, we could get out of EdChoice. However, across the state, we are seeing how inherently flawed the report cards are. That's why you're starting to see so many news stories about it. 2/3 of districts across the state now have a school labeled as failing. And even our lawmakers are starting to admit that it's not necessarily the schools, but the state report cards themselves that have failed. Let me give you just one example of this. As many of you know, one of the things that we as a district have worked really, really hard on is to improve our graduation rate, and we've successfully done that. As you can see from this chart, our 4-year graduation rate is above the state average, but our high school is in EdChoice. How can that be? If you recall in the years of 2015 and 16, 16 and 17, 17 and 18, the state changed the test multiple times. And I probably won't get all the acronyms right, but I know we had the OAA, we had the PARC, we had the AIR, we had all these different tests. And because these state tests changed so much, the state deemed these years as what they call safe harbor. And they decided not to count the tests from these years. However, the state report card is based on 3 years of data. So the current report card for this school year is based on graduation rates from the 2012 and 13, 2013 and 14, and the 18-19 school years. So by using old data from students who are now 25 and 26 years old, our high school is in EdChoice this year. This is how absurd our state report cards are. And that's why, according to the state report cards, 2/3 of the school districts have a building in EdChoice. We know 2/3 of the districts don't have a building that are failing. So welcome to the crazy world of school funding. So how are CHUH schools funded? There's a state formula that's based on district wealth. It's based on actual students and special needs. We get about $21 million in state funding from the state. And the vast majority comes from our property taxes. That's about $73 million. And then we get less than $10 million from other funding sources. Because of this formula, districts can receive anywhere from $600 to $10,000 in state funding per pupil, and CHUH receives $2,169 per pupil in state funding. There are a couple of different voucher programs for those in the audience who aren't familiar with that. There's some special ed vouchers, and these amounts vary that come with each one of those vouchers. These vouchers are intended to help children with special needs get those services in a private or a religious school. Another voucher program covers community schools, which is another name for charter schools. And then there's EdChoice vouchers, which are triggered by your local school district's grade on the state report card. There's also some EdChoice that is based on your income. As you can see, CHUH, I said, receives the $2,169 in state funding per pupil, but the amounts of the vouchers are higher. So who pays the difference? We do. The amount is deducted from the CHUH budget. As you can see from this chart, the Peterson Autism and Community School vouchers, they're increasing, but the rate of increase is pretty slight. In some cases, it's even leveled off. The EdChoice voucher is the one I want to focus on. EdChoice vouchers have been increasing at an alarming rate. This is not sustainable. And even if you use a voucher, I think by the time you see this presentation, you'll realize that even long-term funding of this program cannot be sustainable in the future. So now let's look at individual students. As we said in the Kahoot, a little over 1,400 students who live in our district are using the EdChoice voucher, but 94% of those students have never enrolled in, nor have ever attended our schools. This indicates that many of these students are not fleeing a failing school. They never intended to come here, regardless of what grade we got on the state report card. Many in our community who choose private schools do so for cultural or religious reasons. And that's one of the great things about our community. We're diverse, we're inclusive, and that we've always had lots of school choice just because our community has long been home to many private and religious schools. But let's look at an example of how a kindergarten through 8th grade voucher impacts individual children. For the 2018-19 school year, CHUH did receive the $2,167 per pupil in state funding. An EdChoice voucher for a student in kindergarten through 8th grade is $4,650. Where does that difference come from? Both student A and student B do receive the $2,167 in state funding, but the voucher amount is $4,650. 100% of student B's state funding is deducted from the CHUH budget to pay the private school's tuition. But that's not enough. How does the student receiving the voucher get the full amount? 100% of student A's state funding is deducted from the CHUH budget, along with 100% of student B's state funding to pay for the voucher. Student A is left with $0 in state funding. But wait, is that enough? No, that doesn't cover the cost of the voucher. Where does the rest come from? Here's where student C comes in. Student C, who also attends CHUH, gets $2,167 in state funding. So an additional $316 of student C's state funds moved with student B for the voucher. Student B now has the full $4,650 for the voucher. But what about students A and C? CHUH is left with only $1,851 in state funding to go towards the education of students A and C. And our local taxes have to offset these losses in state funding. And the impact is even more severe when you look at a high school voucher. A voucher for grades 9 through 12 is $6,000. So in effect, CHUH schools receive $0 for student A and only $501 in state funding for student C when student B takes the high school voucher. Once again, our local taxes have to offset these losses in state funding. With 1,416 children taking a combination of K-8 and 9 through 12th grade vouchers, CHUH ends up paying out 40% of the state funding we receive to vouchers. We still have more than 5,000 students to educate. Our local taxes have to offset these losses in state funding. And thanks to the most recent state budget that freezes educational funding for the next 2 years, this picture becomes even more grim. This means there is no additional state funding for either our enrollment increases or increases in vouchers. So if more families move into our area, which is usually a good thing for our community, we get no additional state funding. If those families choose to attend CHUH, we get no additional state funding. If those families choose to take a voucher, we get no additional state funding. But we also have to find a way to cover 100% of the cost of that voucher. You may hear the argument that if private schools can educate children for the cost of the voucher, why can't CHUH? Please know that the voucher does not cover the private school student's entire education cost. CHUH covers the cost of items such as busing and staff to create IEPs. Currently, CHUH spends $1.4 million on transportation for private school students. Also, private schools do not have to comply with all of the unfunded state mandates that public schools have to comply with, and they get to select which students they want to accept. And often the students they do not accept require the most services and therefore require additional funding to educate. You may also hear the argument that if CHUH doesn't have to educate student B, then it's saving us money, right? We should be able to reduce costs. We may not be educating student B, but we do have to educate the more than 5,000 students who are attending CHUH schools. And if we look at this chart that I showed earlier, these are the children who are using EdChoice. And when we know that 94% of them have never gone to our schools, Case, you can go to the next slide. Only 90 of the students who are using EdChoice were ever enrolled in our school or were planned for in our budget. So when you divide 90 students across 12 grades, that equates to approximately 7 students per grade. Those 7 students per grade are dispersed across 10 buildings, or across many buildings, depending on the grade. There's not a critical mass to achieve any significant savings. 7 students per grade doesn't mean we can eliminate a class. We can't return 90 textbooks because we don't need them. We can't say we're only going to heat 10 square feet or we're not going to heat 10 square feet of a classroom. It's the economy of scale. I know I just threw a lot of numbers at you. If you're wondering why we're sharing this level of detail with you, it's because if it weren't for EdChoice, we would not have to be asking our community for a levy until 2023. And even then, the millage we would have to ask for would be significantly less. This is clearly unsustainable, especially when you factor in some of the rules of EdChoice and the recent expansions, such as once a child is granted a voucher, that child is entitled to it for the rest of his or her K through 12 schooling, regardless what grade their local school is getting on the state report card. Previously, a child had to be enrolled in a public school before taking the voucher. Then that provision was relaxed to include incoming kindergartners and students moving in from out of state. Now that provision has been eliminated for high school students. Now I will turn it over to my fellow board member, Dan Hines, who is going to cover what we as a board have been doing about this and what you can do about it. Dan?
Good evening. I must say it is really reassuring to see such a full room of people who are so passionate about this issue, and I really appreciate the fact that we have people who are who come from many different perspectives of this issue. And it's really important that we all begin to have these discussions together. This is one of the most wonderful things about this community. I think it's what drew all of us to live in this community. So Jody has given you a pretty in-depth understanding of some of the challenges that EdChoice has left us with. And it's important to us that you understand that this is not the first time that the board has been made aware of the problem, and we have been actively engaged in addressing the problem on your behalf for some time. So I want to just go through some of the advocacy work that your board and your community outside of the board has been undertaking for the past few years. First, Jody was a keynote speaker in Columbus this past fall at the Capitol Conference. I'm very, very proud to share with you that your Cleveland Heights University Heights School Board has been really at the forefront of engaging with the rest of the school districts around the state who have been hit with this funding problem. And so we reached out through channels that school boards have, and we called for a meeting at the Capitol Conference in the fall. And we had over 100 school districts attend that meeting, which Jody spoke at. And what we're finding is that many of the districts around the state actually are just learning about this. So it's been a nice opportunity for your board and your administration to serve the rest of the state in that way. An EdChoice Steering Committee has been created that your Board of Education is closely involved in. We have, board members have presented to local realtors about the problem, sharing the funding issues. We have spoken to elected officials about the problem, to senior groups about the funding issues, and at the Heights Family Academy. I have personally spoken in Columbus over this past summer to the Ohio House of Representatives Education Subcommittee on the issue. I gave testimony last summer. The superintendent, the treasurer, and our communications supervisor are all engaged in the First Ring Advocacy Network. The board has adopted a number of resolutions over the past few years related to school funding, to EdChoice, as well as to the state report card, which has inappropriately put too many of our schools on the EdChoice list. So what can the rest of the community do to engage in the solution for this problem, which is unsustainable, as Jody mentioned, both for the school district as well as for the schools who are receiving these funds? There's a number of things that we can do. We can contact our state lawmakers and make one simple request. Stop deducting EdChoice voucher payments from school district funds. Instead, fund new vouchers from state funds directly. Here we have some of the people in Columbus and elsewhere where members of the audience, members of the community should direct those comments. This is all going to be posted on the website. There are some much more local possibilities for you to get engaged. Throughout the state, there are advocacy networks, and I am very proud to share with you that the Heights Coalition for Public Education is the gold standard by far, and I would encourage everyone to like the Heights Coalition for Public Education on Facebook, and also to visit the Heights Coalition for Public Education's website. It's a great clearinghouse of information. I encourage people to get involved, to attend the different functions that the coalition hosts. Cleveland Heights is also home to one of the most well-known, I call her a warrior for public education, and that is Jan Ressiger. Jan is extremely well respected throughout the state and outside of the state, and she has a blog that she updates regularly. It is fantastically informative and very well done. This, again, will all be on the website, so you don't have to worry about copying it down now. Finally, the Heights Coalition for Public Education has actually created a sheet, some talking points that folks can use to inform themselves more in terms of their own advocacy. It's a yellow piece of paper that will be available on the way out the door. So I encourage everybody to pick one of those up and to engage further on the issue. Thank you. Next, we'll have Scott Gaynor, who is our Chief Financial Officer, come up and talk some more nuts and bolts about the finances of the district.
Thanks, Dan. Good evening. So this is my 25th year here at Cleveland Heights University Heights City Schools. And what I want to do tonight is kind of continue the conversation that we're having about some general school funding concepts, and also to try to answer some frequently asked questions, both that I've received recently, but also some questions that I see repeated over my course of years. One thing that people have a hard time getting a handle on is there's this notion that school funding in the state of Ohio is a shared responsibility between the state and between the local community. Well, it is a shared responsibility, but you can see from the graph we have here, it's not an equally shared responsibility. You know, there's clearly a majority of the revenue that comes to our schools is from property taxes. Here it's 63%. So, as was mentioned previously by Jody, you know, this method of funding schools has been ruled unconstitutional multiple times by the Ohio Supreme Court. And it has been ruled unconstitutional because of the over-reliance on property taxes. And really what a result of that is that different communities have inequitable education because certain communities can and will choose to support their schools over what others might. So that was the basis for that. I will often, based on those taxes, get a question about, well, why are my taxes so high compared to perhaps my neighbor in another community? And you know, that's really a function of the services we provide, the programs that are offered. I know the superintendent's going to talk a little bit about that later. But one of the other things that I think needs to be remembered is that Cleveland Heights University Heights is 83% residential. So, you know, unlike a Solon or a Beechwood or a Mayfield that has a significant commercial or industrial tax base that helps offset some of the burden of funding public schools in our communities, which is one of the things we love about the Heights, it's primarily residential. So homeowners actually end up, you know, bearing the burden of a lot of the funding of public schools. And also, as Jody mentioned previously, you know, for, per pupil state funding is frozen for the next biennial budget. So for this school year and next school year, we're receiving the same amount of money from the state that we received the previous year. The next slide we have here is the general fund expense. So people will say, okay, so I see where the money comes from, where does the money go? Again, the superintendent's going to speak to some of the programs and services and supports that we have in place, but big picture, what you can see here is that public education is a service industry. We are staff supporting students, providing services to kids. 80% it is generally the standard you'll see for the amount of budget that is staff. Ours is slightly lower this year. We tend to be around 80%, but you see that we're trending about 75% now because the ratios are off because of that 19% green area, which is these vouchers, that cost of those continue to increase. So what we like to do is find benchmarks. We all like to do this. We all like to find benchmarks. We all like to try to compare ourselves to other districts. That's the whole purpose of the state report card. And it's one of those things where there are many, many different calculations out there. In fact, we find a lot of people who are doing their own calculations. And that's fine, but I think there are some things you have to consider and some things you have to remember that we'll go into. But one of the things that we want to note here is for our purposes tonight, and you saw that in the Kahoot earlier, we are using the numbers that are submitted to Ohio Department of Education and that are represented on the state report card. That's the measure and the verifiable, identifiable source that they use to use for EdChoice designation, but also there is financial data that's provided there too. So this is a snapshot, a screen. The link is at the bottom, but if you go to the Ohio Department of Education's website, you can go to my report card, find my district, and when you do that and go to the tab that has finances there, you're going to see the numbers we're going to share with you tonight, which is the $14,404 per pupil that we're spending annually. So what we did is that same calculation or that same report for multiple districts in the area, just again to try to draw some comparisons to see how we compare to other districts that are near us. So you see that at 14,404, we're above the average there of 13,608, and you see, for example, the Beechwoods and the Shakers a little higher. You see the Euclid much lower, but again, it's one of those data points that you can look at, but it doesn't necessarily tell the whole story. And so that's kind of the caveat that I want to give when anyone's doing their calculations or looking at these numbers. The next slide will show you that often it is not an apples-to-apples comparison, or that you really have to dig deep or look at multiple data points when you're trying to do these comparisons and calculations. So, someone will say, I've looked at your budget, I've divided it by the number of pupils, and your costs are way higher than X district. Well, sometimes you have to consider, does your data source include the cost of the vouchers that we have? Our 5-year forecast does. I can tell you Cleveland Heights University Heights disproportionately affected by vouchers, EdChoice in particular. In fact, we are 6th in the state in terms of dollars going to EdChoice vouchers. The only 5 that are above us are 5 of the big urban 8. So, and we're first in Cuyahoga County. So we have a significant amount of money going to EdChoice vouchers that can skew those numbers if that's one of the data points you're looking at. For example, some districts have preschool costs. We have preschools. Other districts might not have that. Districts may or may not host a career technical education program. As we do, we're the lead for our 5-district consortium, so people could be capturing costs in any calculations that they're trying to do. And even something as simple as, over the years, people have said, well, what about Lakewood? Lakewood's costs are lower. Why aren't yours that low? And until you pick up the phone and actually talk to someone from Lakewood, you can't necessarily know why that is. Again, it's the programs, it's the supports. But for example, Lakewood doesn't bus students. So that's millions of dollars that our district and other districts would pay that isn't a cost of Lakewood's. And again, it's not something that you would necessarily know or see from just doing these comparisons. Or, as we do, we will bus elementary students who are more than 1 mile away from their school. Some districts will only bus elementary students if you're more than 2 miles away. So there are many, many factors that you really have to look at and consider when you're trying to draw these comparisons. So that's just, a few caveats that I want to give, because I know a lot of people do that, and even with the ODE numbers, you still have to ask those questions as you go through. The next slide is another question that's sometimes asked in a benchmark that ODE puts out there, which is, so of that spending that you have, how much of it goes to the classroom? Because that's often a question that people will ask. So again, and I think this was one of the Kahoot questions that we had, we took those same districts, we did an average, but also ran those reports from the report card, and you can replicate these numbers yourself. But you'll see we're on the high end of that benchmark at 67.1% versus 63 of the average and 58 of the average across the state of spending that is directly related to classroom instruction. So again, people, will ask why levies? Everyone hates levies. You hate to talk about them. We hate to talk about them. People have a hard time wrapping their head around the fact that there's just no progressive revenue source. There's not a source of revenue to districts that increases with inflation. So, we have property taxes, as we've already talked about, that are frozen by House Bill 920. And again, you hear how that House Bill 920, but for example, what that is, say we passed a levy in 1980 for whatever amount of millage, and it was bringing us $5 million back in 1980. And guess how much that levy is bringing us today, 40 years later? $5 million. So that's what House Bill 920 does. It freezes the amount of money you're getting from a levy at the time you pass it. So really, although your costs are going to increase kind of at a steady inflationary kind of a pace, or when you have these explosions of vouchers, even a higher rate, your revenue really is kind of a step, because you have a levy, you pass it, you're flat. Then you have to pass another levy, then you're flat. Then you pass another levy, and then you're flat again. And I would even argue, so our state funding, as we've said, is frozen for the next 2 years. And because of the vouchers that we have and the deductions we're seeing, that's actually even regressive in terms of the money we're seeing there. So knowing this, what have we been trying to do to minimize the ask of the community? Because again, there are lots of programs and supports that our educators believe are important for our kids, many things that the community expects. But we try to remain sensitive to the high tax burden and also try to balance this efficiency and effectiveness. So back in fiscal 16-17, those of you who were in the district may remember that we reduced over 40 positions then, so that was a $3.25 million savings. That was something that happened prior to the last levy in 2016. We also have on here reducing the IT budget by doing some things that were previously outsourced, bringing those in-house. 17-18, we reduced another $1.3 million in staff. Something as simple as moving from Microsoft to Google platform district-wide and not having to pay all those licenses, because and some of us, personally, I don't love Google, but it's one of those things that you do to try to save money. Moving the cost of professional staff development to grants. Our assistant superintendent has done a great job of making that happen. And embedded in the 5-year forecast in the next several years, we have an additional commitment to $750,000 in savings each one of those years. And so what that has done is allowed us to take a levy that was passed in 2016, calculated and intended to last for 3 years, and stretch it to a 4th year, despite the fact that we're fighting against the state with all of these additional voucher reductions that we're seeing. Here we have an abbreviated version of the 5-year forecast. This is a document that is required to be approved by school boards and submitted to the Ohio Department of Education twice a year, in November and in November and May. It's pretty straightforward. This is, again, is an abbreviated version, and I know it's in your handout, but you're really in each year just taking your cash, looking at the revenue you get, the money you're spending, so you see an ending cash that carries forward to the next year, and you move forward. And there is a full forecast and underlying assumptions out on the district website. Under the Finance tab, you can go and you can see all 5-year forecasts, a history for the last year and a half of the 5-year forecast. Our board, in an effort to be transparent and kind of keep this out front, has actually asked us to bring them the forecast every month, rather than just in November and May when it's required to be passed. You can also see on the district website the CAFR, the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report. You'll see a PAFR, a Popular Annual Financial Report. You're going to see some school funding information that's written by lay finance committee members that kind of goes a little more into House Bill 920 and some other things. But what the forecast does show you is that revenue, again, remains flat while your costs continue to rise, particularly, and we've kind of pulled vouchers out from expenditures to show exactly how much that's been increasing over the term of the forecast. And one thing to note is, so we're trying to address that deficit that you see in the forecast, that without passing a levy in 2020, we're currently estimating about $5 million that would be required in reductions over and above the $750,000 you see each year. And again, if you'll remember in the previous slide, 75 to 80% of your budget is staff. So when you're talking about $5 million in reductions, you're really talking about reducing staff, reducing programs and services that you're providing. So this slide, I have to laugh because, a lot of times I'll get a resident who will call and they'll be like, I'm done with levies, I'm moving to Mayfield, I'm moving to Orange. Well, just so you know, March of 2020, these are some of our folks that are with us in terms of, and again, it's just this whole notion that school funding is and the requirements that districts have to go and ask for these levies is unfortunate, unconstitutional, it's flawed. One thing I'll kind of piggyback on what Dan mentioned earlier, part of the advocacy that we're doing in our first ring groups, that both the superintendent and I and others, is we've really been working on with some legislators, Kopp and Patterson, to try to vet what would be a complete overhaul of school funding in the state of Ohio, something that's progressive, something that wouldn't require districts to spend time and all the angst of having to go and ask for levies, and something that would be equitable across the state. And the last thing I have here is the question that most people say at the end of it all is, well, how much are we talking here? What's this going to cost me? So the levy that we have on the ballot for March of 2020, $276 a year per $100,000 of home, or around $23 per month. And that's it for my section. I'll bring Superintendent Kirby back up here.
All right. As I start this next session, I do want to recognize Cleveland Heights City Council member Melody Hart, who was able to join us. I know she was coming from another meeting, so if you could stand, please, be recognized. So before I talk about the things that are at risk if the levy fails, I do want to start celebrating the successes that we've had in the most recent year. During the first week in March, we are going to be having our annual State of Our Schools session, where we'll talk about many more of our successes, but I wanted to point out some of these as a preview to that session. Our graduation rate, as mentioned early in the presentation, for school year 19, the preliminary number is 86.6%, the highest ever for Heights High, and certainly higher than the state of Ohio. Our performance in K-3 literacy performance also grew on the state report card, in addition to career and technical education. So those are a couple of bullet points from the state's report card, but we know that there are many other measures that are really, really important to us as a community. For example, we recently earned AP Honor Roll distinction, one of 9 districts in the state of Ohio. I did 23 years of work in Chicago. This is a distinction that districts all over the country, tens of thousands, are pursuing, and we were one of the only in Cuyahoga County, only 9 in Ohio, who were able to earn this. And that was really concentrated collaborative work from the entire community. Also at Noble Elementary School, the preschool there earned 5-star designation from the state. And finally, you can see even more of our successes in the quality profile that was passed out as you all came in. That will be mailed out to homes, so you'll get one copy if you came tonight. You'll have a copy to share, another copy as well in your homes over the next week. So we're in the last year of a 5-year strategic plan, and it's anchored on 5 key goals: student outcomes, educational approach, parent and community, valued professionals, and a culture of excellence. Finally, operational resources. We've made great progress in all of these areas with the support of the community. If that support does not continue, however, many of our gains are at significant risk. So our first goal strives to ensure that every student graduates ready to pursue college and career. We know this is important for families. We know this is important for students. This is also extremely important for a community, the lifeblood of a community, the ability for students that come from our high school to be ready to be successful in college, successful in a career path if that is what they choose. So what's at risk here? We've had success in this goal due to ongoing community support, but without that, we risk maintaining our graduation rate, class size, curriculum materials, the supports that we have in our wonderful primary classes, both our AP program and our IB program in the middle schools, the professional development and support that our teachers receive. All of these things are at risk. We were only able to get these gains with system structures and programs, and unfortunately, those things are not free. Money is needed to make those programs come to life. Strategic Plan Goal 2 is designed to ensure that students receive an excellent education, each student in our district. This connects with educating the entire child and providing them with a truly expansive, comprehensive education. And I remember when I was interviewing for the position of superintendent, one of the things that many folks in the area said were special about Cleveland Heights University Heights was the broad education that students received and the multiple opportunities that they had, specifically in the arts in the community. I've been hearing a lot about this during my entry planning phase, not only the variety of music programs, but also extracurricular activities, sports, and the many opportunities the students have to show their growth and leadership. We know this type of exposure is critical to the development of the whole child, a metric that the report card unfortunately does not measure. In addition, the social-emotional supports and gifted services that we offer truly make our district special. Finally, we are at the forefront of the equity work in our state and are taking a deep dive into resource allocation to ensure that we are walking the talk of our equity policy. But without continued support for the levy, we will not have the resources that we need to maintain our momentum in all of these areas which make our community stand out amongst other communities and add value in immeasurable ways. We are extremely proud and are receiving state recognition for our work in this area, ensuring that parents and community partners are welcomed and fully engaged in supporting and enhancing student learning. We've been engaged in partnerships to bring wraparound services to our schools. We are building out our 5-school consortium in career and technical education, and we are deepening our work in family engagement. All of these efforts rely on funds to ensure families and students have the supports, information, and resources that they need. Expanding our post-secondary planning support is an area where many parents have indicated great interest, building on our AVID program in the middle schools and our AP and CTE programs at the high school. This is critical work, again, that I say connects to the health and vitality of both Cleveland Heights and University Heights. Goal 4 undergirds all of our goals and the strategic plan. This speaks to our ability to attract and retain a strong, caring staff to teach and support our students. If the levy fails, the entire strategic plan is at risk. We already are engaged in an annual process of common sense reductions that we make as a part of our fiscal stewardship, but all positions are on the table: administrative, teacher, staff, and as many of you all know, our current union contract is only 1 year because we only were able to certify for 1 year given the challenges around funding. And it's very difficult to plan strategically with a year-to-year union contract. Goal 5 is centered on ensuring that we have a strong infrastructure for our finances, technology, and our facilities. So this really connects to the operational excellence of the district. Our challenges as a district in this goal would be instantly noticeable as we would see a decline in our ability to maintain our facilities, our playgrounds, and our overall school grounds. We also could not guarantee that we could offer transportation to our students and families as we currently do. And the biggest risk, of course, is this next strategic planning cycle, which is going to be very much determined by what happens around funding. We are just starting the 2025 renewal process and are reviewing our current strategic plan and identifying areas for focus in the next 5 years. We are on the brink of greater success for our district and greater success for our community. That success is threatened if the levy fails. Simply put, rather than building on successes, the strategic plan will be an exercise in triage as we seek to stay afloat as a district. So our focus will go from building on success to survival.
I'm following the instructions. Walk behind the screen. We knew many of our elected officials tonight had prior commitments, but I want to recognize Cheryl Stevens, who walked in, our county council rep. Cheryl has been instrumental in getting us additional funding for some more resources. And Davita Russell, our new city council rep. Thanks for being here. I'm here because my 2 children received a great education in the Heights schools. When I say this, I know many of you are in agreement, but some of you are likely rolling your eyes thinking I'm a crazy man. If you're paying attention, there's strong factual evidence great things are happening in this building and in our district. This year's quality profile demonstrates this evidence. If you didn't get one tonight, it gets mailed to all households. Yours will arrive shortly. One of the indicators is graduation rate. It's a regulated state measure governed by the state. Our graduation rate continues to climb, and we're well above the state average. But last year, the state put us on their EdChoice list because they designated this building as low performing. Low performing solely based on our graduation rate. But remember, that measure is above state average. The graduation data they're using ignores all recent data except for the last 4 years, and instead goes back to 2012. That's state law. Our community, that's all of us in this room, invested $100 million of our hard-earned income in this new building. Not all of you voted for the bond issue that made this building possible, but this made-up, fictional, low-performance label hurts every single one of us because it makes our community less desirable to live in. I understand the concern when we must put a tax levy on the ballot. But what about the outrage of this EdChoice craziness? Ironically, if it wasn't for EdChoice, we wouldn't need this levy. We're not losing kids to EdChoice. Our state aid funding is being lost because of EdChoice. If the state Republican leadership want EdChoice to appease their base of supporters, then please fund 100% of it and put it in your budget and not take the monies earmarked away from our students. Also, if our state leadership repealed House Bill 920 back from 1976 and addressed the unconstitutionality of the way we fund schools in Ohio, we wouldn't need any school levies. I mean, maybe we should look at what other states do. We're one of the few states that have to do this. If we don't ask for this levy, our schools will be much less than what they are today, and our taxes will still be high. I've been on the school board for 4 years. During this time, we've cut over $5 million in annual cuts. We promised to make the last levy last 3 years. We stretched it for 4. There's so much misinformation being spread around about our costs and our successes. As much as I believe the state report card is horribly misleading when it comes to letter grades, the handout details our state report card comparative cost per pupil and salary data. These are real comparative numbers from the state and not social media. The people spreading this misinformation on social media want you to think the comparative numbers are much higher and the comparative gaps are greater, and in some cases manipulating the facts to exaggerate their positions. For example, you're going to see these people saying CHUH spending $80 million, $150 million, and up to over $1 billion more than comparative districts. This information is disingenuous because the comparisons are not apples-to-apples comparisons, and they're not factually accurate when you look at the report cards. And with the billion-dollar number, they're multiplying their number out 20 years. Seriously, 20 years? How can you realistically compare something 20 years out? You're going to see complaints on the way that we pay our nurses. The way it's published, it lists the average of just 4 of our nurses and conveniently ignores the balance of our entire nursing staff. This isn't an accurate analysis. This headline quote, 64% of teachers average salary of $90,200 per year. Well, if it's an average, then look at the average of all 100% of our teachers. The real average for all our teachers is on the report card handout. By reviewing this, it's clear to me alternative facts has come to the Heights. Be very careful with what you believe on social media. It's still a wild, wild west with little regard to civility and reality. For those that get great joy in needlessly attacking us, all I can say, your words are a weapon that end up hurting the very same community you live in. I'll be the first to admit we have a lot of challenges, and we're working really hard to address those. And high taxes is one of them. For this levy, the cost is $23 per month based on a $100,000 home. Locally, there are 9 school levies on the ballot this March, and I am sorry we have to be one of them. As you can see from the district comparisons in the handout, our costs are high, but they're in line with like district spending. We'll be posting a video of this form on our website so everybody in the community can view it. I understand there's many questions. We've already addressed some of them tonight. On our website, we added a school funding question submission form. To be compliant with public information request, we're going to be addressing each question in writing and making the answers available publicly back on the website. This way, everybody can view the questions and answers. Voting for the levy or against the levy has consequences. Just please vote. We take advocacy very seriously. We're reopening the application process for our board-level advocacy committee. You can learn more about that on our website. Please consider applying. Come to our State of the Schools address and the Heights Family Academy. These are open to the public. The dates are up on the screen. If you don't know how to find us on the web, we're at chuh.org, and you can find our contact, including all your individual board contact information on the board there. And I want to thank you all for your time. I know we're not always in agreement with things, but we are one community, and we just need to be civil with each other when we look at these kinds of things. Thank you very much for your time.